In August 2024, allegedly, 6 Palestine Action activists drove a repurposed prison van into Elbit Systems' weapons factory in Filton, Bristol, in the UK. They allegedly sabotaged the factory and inside it the Zionist fascist weapons such as quadcopter drones, particularly the ones that Palestinians say mimic the screams of women and children to lure Palestinians out of hiding to help them. And those Palestinians are then murdered by those same drones that have weapons like grenades and guns attached to them. The action, according to Elbit Systems, cost the company £1 million in damage. 6 of the actionists were arrested at the site itself after the action, and then a further 4 were arrested from their homes all over the UK in relation to the action. Then, in November 2024, a further 8 people were arrested in connection to the action. And then again in July 2025, a further 5 were arrested, and then another person was arrested after that, supposedly in relation to the action. 24 people, all remanded into custody at the point of their arrest, which is a fancy way of saying they were put in jail without trial. At the very least, until they have a trial, which at the point of this video is for some of them going to be in August 2026. They have been repeatedly denied bail, and even in one case, one of the actionists, Cameron Ahmed, a carer for his parents, was granted bail on special condition for being a carer. Then, another High Court judge blocked the bail decision. This is a completely unheard of move in the so-called British justice system. The actionists were being held under terrorism charges, with most of the 24 being charged months before the proscribing of Palestine Action as a terrorist group by the UK government, and regardless, past affiliation with a proscribed group is not supposed to be regarded in the same way as it would be after said prescription. The charges, however, were swiftly dropped to non-terror charges, with all 24 of the activists broadly charged with the same things: aggravated burglary, criminal damage, and in one particular case of one of the actionists, Samuel Corner, grievous bodily harm. All of the Filton 24 have continually denied these charges. It's also important to state that in the UK, the maximum amount of time a prisoner can be held on remand without trial is 6 months, and all of the Filton 24 at this point have been on remand in prison without trial for 8 to 17 months. However, in a sweet twist of irony, the very week that I'm putting out my Free the Filton 24 video, a bunch of the Filton 24 activists have actually been granted bail and also been found not guilty for some of the charges that were against them, the details of which I'll cover at the end of the video. The case is currently at the stage of one trial being done, with 5 people being found not guilty of some charges and no verdict being reached by the jury for other charges. It's an ongoing situation, and I'll keep you as updated as I possibly can in the description of this video. But ultimately, this video is more about imperialism, popular resistance to it, and how it always inevitably comes home to roost. This video, like all of them, is only made possible by my amazing patrons. Head over to patreon.com/DJ Mule and consider supporting me in my content creation, as this is my only form of income at the minute, including my live streams which I do on Twitch in the week. Your money will literally go to paying my bills, my rent, and my groceries. Head over to patreon.com/DJ Mule, and if you don't care about me, don't forget to consider the boy. If this is the first time you're hearing about the Filton 24, you're probably thinking, damn, this sounds like massive state overreach. And you're right, there are plenty of direct action groups that have engaged in direct action in the UK in the past and not been treated nearly as severely as this. Direct action, of course, is the act of sabotage, striking, blockading, and other forms of protest that has a direct effect, hence direct action, on things that the people doing it are morally opposed to. For example, the suffragettes were in fact far more violent and ready to cause harm to other human beings than Palestine Action would have ever dreamed of. Well, you can't really call cops human beings, but you know what I'm trying to say. There are plenty of direct action groups for environmental causes, including Just Stop Oil and anti-fracking protesters, and they have certainly been detained and in some cases charged with offences for their direct action, even though some of those actionists were jailed for non-terror related crimes and even held on remand. None of the organisations were ever prescribed as a terrorist group, despite engaging in exactly the same tactics as Palestine Action. And even more bizarrely, historically, a number of Just Stop Oil actionists were spared jail time or even released from jail time early. And in fact, multiple Palestine Action activists have also been spared jail time. When they prescribed them as a terrorist organization in June 2025, after Palestine Action Actionists broke into RAF Bryce Norton and sprayed a bunch of red paint on a military aircraft, a spy plane known to have been participating in the genocide of Palestinians by flying over Gaza and giving intelligence to the Israeli state, the British state alleged that Palestine Action were a violent group who were intending to cause fear to the British public. When the first of the Filton 24 were arrested in August 2024, the Crown Prosecution Service also alleged that they had a terrorist connection. The British press has doggedly and desperately tried to paint Pal Action and anyone associated with them or any actions they did as evil and scary somehow. Even in some cases, with Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary at the time, who brought the prescription to Parliament, saying things like, "Some don't know the full nature of the group." But we do though, don't we? Because Palestine Action have been open about what their aims are for the entirety of their existence. Pal Action showed proudly, years before their prescription, what kind of things they were doing and what they were doing them in the name of. The majority of Palestine Action activists were so proud of what they were doing that they refused to remain anonymous. On the Commie Roundtable discussion show I co-host every Sunday, Red Planet, we interviewed founding member Huda Amori in 2023, who proudly told us of the group's entire ethos and their actions. There was nothing that we could see that they could possibly be ashamed of. We then, later on in 2024, interviewed Drew, then member of Palestine Action, who engaged in a single person action on top of the roof of the landlord of Elbit Systems, Fisher German. In his interview with us, he earnestly and bravely described his motivations and reasoning as similar to Huda's initial explanation. From all accounts and evidence, there was an entire membership who broadly agreed on the founding principles of the group. And of course, why would you be ashamed and hide those principles when your entire modus operandi is to stop the British state colluding with a genocidal, apartheid-loving, rogue colonial state when people in that state rioted to demand a vote to legalize raping Palestinian prisoners to death? Yes, that's real. But of course, the British state's involvement with that state is where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean completely f***ed. The truth of it is that the state cracked down so hard on the Filton 24 because Palestine Action, and by extension, direct action, is so effective. In 2022, the factory of an Elbit subsidiary, Ferranti P&C in Oldham, had to close due to repeated targeting by Palestine Action. In December 2023, a landlord of Elbit Systems sites, Fisher German, dropped them after repeated targeting of their offices in Manchester and Birmingham. This was the action Drew participated in. In March 2024, an Elbit site in Tamworth was shut down, and in the 3 months prior, Pal Action had forced 4 UK companies to cut ties with Elbit. These are but a few victories in the short history of Palestine Action, and there's almost too many to count. But the point is that Palestine Action had successfully disrupted the arms trade in Britain that relates specifically to the genocidal colonial Zionist project known as Israel so effectively that not only did Israel know what Palestine Action was and what they were doing, but they were also planning alongside the British state to target and punish the group. In April 2025, a Guardian article reported that in September 2024, before the arrest of people who didn't actively participate in the action at Filton, the Attorney General's office had emailed the Israeli Deputy Ambassador Daniela Grudsky-Eckstein with the subject matter, quote, CPS/SO15 in brackets Crown Prosecution Service/Counterterrorism Police close brackets contact details. End quote. This information came after a Freedom of Information request, but the subject matter was heavily redacted. In April 2025, Gideon Saar, the foreign minister of so-called Israel, met in secret with David Lammy. The details of this meeting are shrouded in secrecy, with Lammy claiming in the visit he raised ongoing hostage negotiations, protection of aid workers, the need to end the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, and stop settlement expansion in the West Bank, plus the Iranian nuclear issue. But who believes that that's all they really spoke about, and that the manner in which they spoke about this stuff wasn't heavily biased towards supporting the so-called State of Israel? Saar is just as depraved, fascist, and belligerent towards every brown person in the world as any other member of the Knesset, claiming things such as the ICJ arrest warrants for war crimes against senior Israeli officials are anti-Semitic, and that countries all over the world are complicit in this campaign against them. We can only imagine what kind of things he says in Hebrew when he thinks translators aren't there to listen. This particular meeting between Lamy and Saar happened a month before the announcement by the Home Office and Yvette Cooper as the then Home Secretary that they will be proscribing Palestine Action as a terrorist organization. So what we have here is a completely trumped up proscription after a secret meeting with the foreign minister of Israel. The reasoning behind the proscription hanging on by a very thin waning thread, that thin waning thread being the fact that Samuel Corner is charged with grievous bodily harm, and he is only one of the Filton 24, was Gideon Saar, along with the rest of the Israeli lobby, demanding that the UK government proscribe Palestine Action as terrorists and to treat the Filton 24 as they would treat terrorists in so-called Israel. And ultimately, was it because of Palestine Action's success? These secret meetings and emails add up to paint a very concerning picture, alongside recent revelations that Morgan McSweeney, the protege of Peter Mandelson, who was acting with Jeffrey Epstein, a pretty much confirmed Mossad agent at this point, to interfere in the, at the time, pro-Palestinian Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, with evidence massively suggesting that Mandelson and McSweeney advised Keir Starmer's sweeping reforms of the party. These reforms include removing members' right to vote in leadership elections and the expulsion of multiple pro-Palestinian activists from the party. It paints a picture of one of the most dastardly foreign interference campaigns in British history by so-called Israel. On October the 17th, 2025, after the proscription of Palestine Action, Fatima Zainab, one of the Muslim members of the Filton 6, the group of the 24 who allegedly took part in the action personally, reported that she was subjected to unnecessary invasive medical procedures, including forced urine tests conducted at an alarming rate, 50 times the frequency allowed by prison regulations, according to Resistance Kitchen. Screws at the prison reportedly banned Fatima from wearing her hijab and also stopped her from attending Islamic studies classes, plus withholding her mail. She was the only member of the Filton 24 at that time who was denied her mail. On top of Fatima Zainab's treatment, the treatment of the rest of the Filton 24 also deteriorated. Multiple Filton detainees reported prison staff jeering at them, calling them terrorists, and also having their mail withheld, plus in some cases having their phone privileges removed, meaning that they couldn't even speak to their solicitors. Some of the prisoners' privileges were restored after mass protests by activists outside the various prisons the Filton 24 are being held in. However, others had to take more drastic measures. On the 2nd of November 2025, John Kink, T. Hocher, Kessa Zuhra, and Amu Gib started their hunger strike to protest the removal of prisoner privileges. They collectively sent a letter to prison governance about their demands to restore communication privileges, and they were joined shortly after by Kamran Ahmed and Hiba Moraisi, and were even joined in solidarity by a prisoner in America. Then later they were joined by Louis Chiamarello and Umar Khalid. Not all of those named were part of the Filton 24, as John Kink and Louis particularly were members of the Bryce Norton 5, but what followed is the longest hunger strike by prisoners in British history, with some of the strikers striking for 73 days without food, only ending the strike at the very last minute, choosing to take the UK government's decision to reject a £2 million deal with Elbit Systems as a victory. During the strikes, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese and 5 other Special Rapporteurs even wrote to the UK government to express their concern about the hunger strikers. All of this adds up to a clearly targeted, cruel and unusual punishment of mostly first-time activists who are all young people, with most likely the direction of this punishment coming from so-called Israel. Many of the prisoners have said that their treatment in prison is nothing compared to what Palestinians go through in occupied Palestine, and this is broadly true. In fact, Palestinians receive far more brutal and deadly treatment in their occupied homeland. After the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the Zionist gangs who had travelled to Palestine were armed by the then British occupation soldiers and began various attacks against the indigenous Palestinians who lived there. At first they were small-scale attacks, seizing villages and military outposts abandoned by British soldiers, but in 1948 what we know as the Nakba, or catastrophe, occurred. Zionist militias terrorised, brutalised, killed and raped Palestinian men, women, children, forcing them from their historic homes to begin the Zionist genocidal project known as Israel. Those who were unable to engage in armed struggle but still resisted, Ilan Pappé writes, were put into labour camps, the first Palestinian prisoners of the Zionist entity. It's important to note that even this soon after the Holocaust, Zionist settlers in so-called Israel despised Holocaust survivors, and even despised the Jews who perished in the camps even more. They had a common attitude towards Holocaust survivors. So the hypocrisy of forcing an ethnic group into a labour camp was not something that mattered to them at all. They saw the victims of the Holocaust as weak, and they were the strong Jews who would beat down other weak races to get their so-called self-determination. This is not a hidden fact or some conspiracy theory, and you can read at length what the treatment of Holocaust survivors is like in the Zionist entity nowadays. We can only imagine what the treatment of these Palestinian prisoners was like, as in a TV documentary talking about the Deir Yassin massacre where 107 Palestinians were killed, a veteran of that massacre boasts about seeing his comrades engaging in the rape of children.
אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד, היה לנו בחור אחד ונפטר בו פרא אדם, הוא לקח פשוט מאוד ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. בתוך המכלאות, הם היו במכלאות, אתה יודע, חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם כל העם על הרצפה, ובא מישהו ולוקח מקלע ומטילה, זה מחליף מחסנית.
In the years before and after the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, Palestinian prisoners were released and told horrifying stories of their detainment. The use of chemical weapons, testing unknown drugs, systematic rape and torture, all for the crime of being Palestinian and resisting colonial violence. It should also be noted that all Palestinian prisoners at this time were detained without trial or charge. This is a tradition that remains until this day in 2026. Oppression of thought and freedom of expression became commonplace in occupied Palestine, with Israeli occupation forces regularly attacking and killing Palestinians who dared to protest even peacefully against the illegal occupation and colonization of their homeland. Various different groups, including Samidoun, the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, began to form and demand the release of prisoners without charges against them, and better conditions for those awaiting trial or those convicted. So-called Israel would regularly detain and imprison popular, peaceful resistance leaders, such as Marwan Barghouti, who were key figures in the Palestinian struggle so that it could attempt to destroy the movement and engage in its campaign of ethnic cleansing without obstacle. In these Israeli dungeons, torture was not just used as a mean of getting false confessions from Palestinian movement leaders, but also just for fun. The widespread dehumanizing of Palestinians, and more broadly, every ethnic group in the region that wasn't white and Jewish, with so-called Israelis calling most peoples broadly Arabs, flattening any diversity within the region and labeling often these so-called Arabs as terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. Torture has been, and remains, a constant in the prisons of occupied Palestine. This is not just something that has been reported time and time again by Palestinians, but is something that can be confirmed for people who are brainwashed into racist thoughts about Palestinians by Zionist narratives by the members of the 2025 Global Sumud Flotilla and other members of previous flotillas, some of whom, even though they were white Westerners, had their genitals twisted, punched and penetrated during detainment. These acts of rape and sexual assault are commonplace almost every day for Palestinian prisoners. When people refer to October the 7th, 2023, they often miss the point of the operation that was planned and executed by al-qassam brigades, the military resistance group made up of multiple Palestinian resistance groups. The entire reason was not just to show the world that Palestinians have a right to move freely within their historic homeland, but also to take prisoners to use as leverage in a prisoner exchange. Every Palestinian is acutely aware of how their brethren are treated in Israeli dungeons, and the constant detainment of peaceful movement leaders and, generally speaking, just Palestinian civilians who are doing nothing wrong led to this violent assault on the state that was inevitable. As there have been releases of prisoners as a result of this operation, it can only really be called a success, despite the leveling of massive genocidal punishment against the civilian population of Gaza. Some 2,000 or more Palestinian prisoners were released from what can only be described as inhumanely evil dungeons. After examining this, looking at what we know now of how Palestinians are treated in these places, what happened to the Filton 24, the Bryce Norton 5, and any other supporters of the Palestinian movement abroad, can only reasonably be deduced to be an extension of Zionism's punishment in other countries. But is it really Zionism's punishment methods? To understand what it is that I'm talking about clearly, we have to look at what Israel's function is to imperialism and capitalism. Palestine was most certainly gifted initially to Zionist fascist militias by the British in the 1910s, on one hand to hand over the management of a state that the British no longer wanted to manage through destabilization, on the other hand to pretend it cared about Jewish people and to give them their own land. But the key part is that destabilization. Palestinian resistance to empire has been present for centuries. There have been multiple occupations of Palestine throughout its existence, with the indigenous Palestinians rarely being given sovereignty in any scenario. The Persian Empire, Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire have all occupied Palestine. Arguably, the Palestinians had more freedom under previous occupations than their current one. At least in those occupations, they weren't expelled and genocided from their homes and their land, but they count as occupations nonetheless. When the British decided to gift Palestine to these Zionist militias, they understood that Palestinians wouldn't easily be repressed. They also understood, with the advent of oil manufacturing and more broadly capitalist production and extraction of oil and the discovery of vast oil reserves in West Asia, that they would need to engage in a longer campaign to try and seize some of this oil after the recovery period needed after World War I. Therefore, initially so-called Israel was a placeholder for empire at the time, with Zionist militias being given carte blanche to genocide and ethnically cleanse Palestinians by the powers that used to own it, with their goal to achieve colonial domination in Palestine under the guise of Jewish sovereignty. When those militias regularly needed support and funding from the imperial core countries in Europe, the Zionist lobby in its early years did what it has remained doing so ultimately, and focused on entirely raising money to support the colonial project, and this is something that has continued to this day. With understanding Israel in this way, we can see that Israel is in fact an arm of empire, the empire that is currently occupying the world with white supremacist capitalist hegemony. The countries of Canada, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Europe, of course, headed by the USA as its emperor country. These countries continually fund and trade with Israel because it is advantageous to the imperialist campaign of destabilization and therefore control in the region. Destabilization and control in West Asia means that they can control the flow of oil. It isn't called the petrodollar for nothing. If Israel is consistently belligerent and attacks all of its neighbors in the region, then it is, of course, an effective destabilizer and agitator. It is also an effective military outpost for empire, so that the comfortable citizens within the imperial core are not threatened with any blowback particularly. Israel can say all it likes that it is a sovereign nation, but the reality is that it is a puppet used by the imperial core powers in order to control the flow of oil in the region and to attack its enemies from. The higher-ups in Israel are not unaware of this and constantly walk a fine line between telling their settler colonial populace that they are strong enough on their own to attack a nation like Iran, but also needing to ask the USA for assistance in doing stuff like that, like it's currently doing, essentially in order for retaliation to be massively mitigated. Occupied Palestine and the Palestinians within it is therefore used as a testing ground and test subjects for various domestic repression applications developed by the imperial core. Alongside the poisoning of crops, the destruction of infrastructure, the concentration of an entire population of 2 million people into an open-air prison 1/7 the size of the city of Philadelphia, the genocide of the Palestinian people in the 2-year-long so-called Israeli assault on Gaza, which according to estimates from experts, could easily reach approximately 700,000 Palestinians, with the Zionist entity using internationally prohibited thermal and thermobaric weapons, often referred to as vacuum or aerosol bombs, that when exploding reach temperatures of 3,500 degrees, instantly vaporizing Palestinians. We can see that Israel is not just testing how a Western power could commit a genocide, even while it's being live streamed directly to everybody all over the world, but it is also testing what weapons it can get away with doing it with. Elbit Systems has, since its inception, advertised its weapons it manufactures as battle-tested on Palestinians, Palestinian civilians. Elbit Systems, profiting off the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, is the company that Palestine Action and the Filton 24 targeted in their campaign to stop the genocide. Now, when it's framed like this, it makes it very hard to believe that these people are terrorists, doesn't it? But of course, they're being treated like terrorists because any opposition to Israel is an opposition to empire, the imperial core led by the great Satan, and now you know why they call it that, the USA. Everything that Israel does within the boundaries of Palestine that it occupies is done to test the very strength of human resistance. One of the biggest boundaries it constantly tests is how acceptable will a repressed populace find the unlawful detention of people peacefully protesting an occupation or just general state repression. That's where this entire segment, like the imperial boomerang I'm implying it is, comes back home to the UK. The detention methods used against pro-Palestinian activists in the UK may appear to be Israeli, but these detention methods, even though they're used in Israel, are the empire's detention methods. The Filton 24 are not the first or the latest group to be targeted by the British state in what appears to be conjunction with so-called Israel. Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta is a plastic surgeon and professor of conflict medicine who's been taken to court 9 times in the 2 years since so-called Israel started its genocide in Gaza in 2023. The people instigating the court proceedings are the notorious UK Lawyers for Israel, who are a coalition of lawyers whose entire direction is to defend Israel from criticism by suing people, mostly racialized of Palestinian descent, who say that it's bad that Israel is committing a genocide. I know that sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not.
UKLFI has 2 entities, the Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust and Lawyers for Israel Limited, a private company that has tried to silence support for Palestine that it disagrees with. This year, as aid agencies warned of an impending famine in Gaza, the CEO of Lawyers for Israel suggested in a debate about the war's death toll that the Israeli food blockade could result in a reduction in obesity in Gaza and may therefore increase the average life expectancy there.
Abu Sitta's case relates to a newspaper article he wrote for a Lebanese outlet and his posts on Twitter. In the article, he had written about the martyrdom of Ahmad Nasser Jarrah, who was believed to be a member of Hamas, saying, "The people have no weapon left but revolutionary violence." Dr. Rahmet Al-Adwan is another Palestinian British doctor who, after a targeted campaign of harassment by Zionists and Zionist lobby groups, was suspended by the NHS for supposed anti-Semitism. She was found during an interim hearing before her first tribunal to not pose a risk to patients for her statements, which said, quote, October 7th, the day Israel was humiliated, their supremacy shattered at the hands of the children they forced out of their homes, the children who watched foreign Jews execute their loved ones, rape their land, and live on their stolen soil, end quote. Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, a known to be compromised pro-Israel group in the UK, has campaigned to have her removed from practice, claiming that this was in support of terrorism or terrorist groups. She was also arrested days before her second tribunal by police at her home for unknown reasons. The second tribunal said her posts may impact patient confidence and that they may seek treatment from someone else if they're referred to her. She's been suspended for 15 months for daring to say how she feels about Israel expelling her people from their land. No matter what you think about her or Abu Sitta using terms like revolutionary violence or foreign Jews, these are all claims made by supposed anti-Semitism NGOs in the UK that are unfortunately proven to be completely ideologically captured by Zionism. Dr. Al-Adwan's comment about foreign Jews is unfortunately just evidentially true. She's making the distinction between white European and American Jewish people who came to colonize Palestine, which already had a significant population of Palestinian Jewish people at the time of the Nakba, and those Jews, along with other Jews of Arab descent, are treated as second-class citizens within occupied Palestine. Israel is a white supremacist project. The life of white European and American Ashkenazi Jews is valued way higher than other Jews who are from other backgrounds. If you really want to feel sick, read about what they did to Ethiopian Jews. Abu Sitta is just unfortunately completely correct that Palestinians have no other option than revolutionary violence. That is because, as I've discussed in this video, Israel has routinely murdered or detained any and all peaceful leaders of peaceful protest movements. There is no other option because Israel doesn't allow it. These doctors are clearly being targeted for being Palestinian and criticizing Israel. Over the last 2 years, we've witnessed in the UK a massive bending of the law in order to try and punish people who support Palestinian liberation. We've seen people picketing outside weapons factories be charged with things like the Trade Union Act. This act relating to violence being committed by striking workers, when these people are not striking workers and not committing violence. These protesters have been released with no further action after detainment in all cases of this law being used to suppress them. And of course we're seeing this in the case of the Filton 24 and other Palestine Action Activists, with people being ripped from their homes and their loved ones with violent methods in dawn raids by counter-terrorism police, in some cases with guns, put away on unnecessarily long remand periods. This is all designed to punish and oppress. From what we've examined in this video, we can see that these people are being punished in this way because of their opposition to Israel, and not because they are a threat to Jewish people or anyone else in the UK. The Filton 24, the Bryce Norton 5, and any other direct actionists who have targeted weapons manufacturers or companies doing business with weapons manufacturers have had one goal in their mind the entire time: to stop genocide, to stop a genocidal colonial regime from genociding people in the land that it occupies. That's it. These people have seen what is happening and taken the action that they deem to be the most fit to put a stop to it. They looked at the ruling class, what they are demanding we see as normal, and stood up and said no. Not in our name. Not in the name of the British people. We are standing up against the killing machine and destroying it. At the time of this video's release, 5 of the initial 6 arrested for the Filton action have been found broadly not guilty of the most grievous crimes they were accused of, aggravated burglary and criminal damage, with the 6th, Samuel Corner, receiving the same ruling, but still having an additional charge of grievous bodily harm that the jury did not reach a verdict on. This meant that the other 5 could apply for bail and were granted it for the first time in 17 months. The 6 still have unresolved charges for which a retrial will probably be pushed for by the Crown Prosecution Service, because a prosecution of these individuals is needed in order for the government to justify their prescription of Palestine action. However, since then, all charges of aggravated burglary have been dropped for the Filton 24 across the board. They know that they will not be able to find them guilty of this crime. Also, speaking of this, Palestine Action's prescription was found by a high court to be unlawful, which means that the government could be forced to turn it around. It represents a major victory against state overreach and repression by the imperial boomerang. It's fantastic news, but we must continue to fight. Remember, the ceasefire that we're seeing right now is a smokescreen. Israel has violated the so-called ceasefire 1,500 times, and 300 Palestinians have been killed since September 2025, when it supposedly was declared. The ways to resist remain the same. Just because the press have stopped reporting on pro-Palestine actions in your area doesn't mean that they've stopped. Just because the press have stopped reporting on things that are happening in Palestine doesn't mean that the genocide has stopped. Boycott, divest, sanctions. Boycott so-called Israeli goods, demand your organizations divest from investments in business owned by Israelis or Zionists, demand your country implement sanctions on the Zionist entity. Keep up the fight, and if you don't know how to get involved, go to your local pro-Palestine protest and get to know some of the people there and ask, how can you get involved? Thank you for watching. This is a really important video and I really appreciate you watching it all the way to the end. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and check out all of my links in the description below. Stay locked to the channel for more videos on politics, Palestine, and activism, and I will see you in the next one. Stay excellent to each other.